Steve, what we've also done is, yesterday, as I told you before, we were receiving too many questions to manage. So what we've done is we'll ask the audience to share the questions directly with you over mail in case they have any. You can answer them at your convenience. Yeah.
Very good.
Excellent.
So when I'm finished, do I turn it back to you, or will you just take it?
Yeah. I'll take it from you, and we'll end it there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome you all, to the second day of the CII Marketing Leadership Summit. We have with us Mr. Steve McKee, co-founder of McKee Wallwork and Company. So he's here to talk about the disruption cycle, what it is, why it matters, and what you need to know about it. So a little bit about Steve. Steve is the co-founder of McKee Wallwork, which I mentioned. It's a marketing advisory firm that specializes in generating new momentum for stalled, stuck, and stale organizations across North America. Steve is a prolific author of books such as When Growth Stalls, How It Happens, Why You're Stuck, and What to Do About It. It's an award-winning business book now published in 4 languages. Another book that he's written is Power Branding, Leveraging the Success of the World's Best Brands, which New York Times bestselling author Jay Baer called the definitive book on modern branding. McKee's firm made the Inc. 500 list of the fastest growing private companies in America in its first year, and won the prestigious FE Award for Marketing Effectiveness from the American Marketing Association. Steve has also appeared, he's been a Business Week columnist for a decade, and he writes popular monthly columns for Smart Brief on leadership. He has been published or quoted in the New York Times, USA Today, Forbes.com, Investors, Business Daily, and the Los Angeles Times, among others. Without further ado, Steve, thanks again for joining us here today. I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, and I trust everybody can hear me. Good morning. Hope you're having a wonderful conference. I'm delighted to be here to share with you my perspective on something that we call the disruption cycle. I'm very curious to learn how relevant you believe this is to your situation. I think it's a fascinating bit of research that we've been doing here in the United States. For the company's been doing research for about 15 years. This particular form we've done for the last 2 years. And this is the first exposure that we're making to an international audience. So I'll be very curious what your reaction is. So I'm very excited to share it with you. And if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is begin with a somewhat provocative quote from the former chairman and CEO of 3M, who said, "The core of every business is dying." When I first heard that quote, or first read it, actually, I thought it was somewhat stunning. And my immediate reaction was, that's not true. It's sort of an overstatement. But then I began reflecting on the fact that perhaps it might be true. If I was to ask any of you to name a company that's maybe 100 years old, you could probably do it. There are a handful in every community, and it's not too difficult to come up with. But if I asked you to name a company that is 200 years old or 300 years old, you might struggle with that a little bit more. Just because companies tend to outlive people, we tend to think that the companies that surround us are eternal. They existed before us and they will exist after us, but that's not entirely true. Just a couple of points I'd like to share with you. I went and looked up the oldest company in the United States, and it's the Bank of New York, founded by Alexander Hamilton, who's been quite the name recently with the famous Broadway show. The Bank of New York was founded in 1784. In some respects, that sounds like a long time ago, but the older I get, the more I think that it's really not that long ago. I actually looked up the oldest company in India, and I don't know if this is true, but this is what the internet tells me, that Perry's, if that's how you say it, was founded in 1788, just about the same time. And again, that's very old, but not so old, 225 years or so. The oldest company in the world, according to lore, is a company in Japan called Kangogumi. It's a construction firm that was founded in 578 AD. So that is quite old. Now they cheated a little bit because in the year 2006 the company went bankrupt. It was acquired out of bankruptcy, and so it still technically exists. And it's changed its business model several times over the years, but 1,400 years in business is a pretty long time. Nevertheless, it sort of is the exception that proves the rule that the core of every business is dying. Some businesses die slowly, some businesses die more rapidly, but it's incumbent upon us as business leaders to keep our businesses healthy and thriving and alive. I read an article recently in the New York Times about a company called Time and Style in Kailash, South Delhi. And this was an interesting quote here about the owner. It said, for the past couple of years, Santander Wadhwa has struggled to keep his business alive amid the growth of online retail. His specialty watch store, Time and Style, used to be filled with throngs of locals. Now he estimates he gets half as many customers. So the question you might ask when you read a story like that, or like many others similar to it, is what happened? And a lot of things may have happened, but one of the things that has happened, we know, is the incredible advent of e-commerce, specifically Amazon and companies like it, who have really captured a great deal of market share. And in this time of a global pandemic that we're all struggling with, they're actually advancing the case very much more. And this is one significant disruption, if you will, that's going to continually affect more and more companies. We know that Amazon has built its largest office in India recently, and the analysts at Forrester say that the online e-commerce is going to grow very significantly in your country by 2024. And this is a massive operation. Amazon has 40 other offices, 67 shipping centers, 1,400 delivery stations, more than 60,000 people and 155,000 contractors in your country. Obviously, things are changing for us all. We're all being affected by global e-commerce, among many other things, but global e-commerce. There's another company that Amazon has affected a lot bigger than the jewelry store that we were just speaking about. And I'm talking about another Fortune 500 company that you are all likely familiar with, and that is IBM. It's really a fascinating story, IBM. This chart details it in a rather interesting way. Between 2012 and 2018, IBM had 20 consecutive quarters of sales declines. Then they grew a little bit in 2018. They've had some recent difficult quarters. They just had another difficult quarter. They're actually spinning off part of their business. Suffice it to say that for the past 8 years, IBM has been in the red more than it's been in the green. And that's a pretty significant thing. Of course, what happened to IBM, generally speaking, again, I'm generalizing, but Amazon happened to IBM with the introduction of Amazon Web Services and their cloud computing, that whole piece of the industry. And I've been following IBM for some time, and I think their strategy is actually pretty smart and always has been. It's just a very difficult ship to turn. It's a very large ship. And so when the market moves suddenly in one direction, it's difficult for IBM to retool itself. The fascinating thing about this is, what company do you know that could go through 8 years of mostly sales declines and still be in business? It's really rather incredible that IBM still exists as a company, but I have a theory as to why. And it has to do with the IBM brand. And as we get into the disruption cycle, this is a bit of a prelude to the research. I want to underscore the importance of your brand, or your reputation, if you'd rather think of it that way. What people think and believe and feel and value about the suite of products and services that you bring to market. As you may know, there are a number of firms that calculate the value of global brands. This is one of them. It's a company called Interbrand. And every year they hire an expensive consulting firm to run all kinds of calculations to identify what the value of a brand is worth. And for the past few years, Apple has been the most valuable brand in the world. They say it's worth 234 billion US dollars. That's pretty remarkable. That's not That's not the warehouses or the inventory or the intellectual property. It's just the brand of Apple. And you can read across the top, you can see Google and Amazon and Microsoft, these e-commerce companies, their brand value is going up significantly. But if you look at number 12 on the list, IBM, you note a 6% decline in brand value. And that makes sense, given what IBM has been going through over the past 8 years, that its brand value would be in decline. But that's not what I want to underscore. What I'd like to point out is that because IBM is still worth 40 billion US dollars, it was worth in the 70s, I think, when this decline began, $70 billion. It has room to struggle because every company is going to struggle with disruption. And so IBM's customers perhaps are more patient because they trust the company. IBM's employees perhaps believe in their place of work, and so they're more willing to stick with it. Even the investment analyst community in the global stock markets believe that IBM has something to offer the world, and so they cut it some slack. They give it some room to suffer, and that's a really important point as we get into the disruption cycle. As Sir George said, the core of every business is dying. It is incumbent upon us as business leaders to keep our businesses alive and thriving. And IBM has been sick for the past several years, but because it was so healthy, it was such a robust company for so long, more than 100 years, it had room to suffer a little bit. And so that's the first thing I'd really like to communicate with you all that might be a new idea to you. And that is that your brand, your reputation, whatever word you'd like to use for that, some people are more comfortable with reputation than brand, is an asset unlike any other asset your organization owns. Because as it says here, if you own intellectual property, it will expire or be stolen. Roofs leak, automobiles break down, valued employees leave. Every asset that you own as an organization is going to depreciate over time, with the exception of your reputation. Now, as we saw from the previous slide, corporate reputations do go up and down, but they don't have to. And so if you think about it, when a brand is launched, its value is zero. The day it's launched, it's not known. There's no value associated with it. But soon after, it starts building value, and over the course of time, it can build a great deal of value. In the case of IBM, more than 100 years, it can build billions and billions of dollars in value. The other thing I'd like to underscore, though, is to really make sure that we're speaking about the same thing, is that when I talk about brand, our conception of brand is not your logo or your graphic design package. It's really the sum and substance of everything that you do. There's no way to separate the business from the brand. So yes, it involves your advertising and your marketing and your go-to-market things, but it also involves your pricing strategy, whether your price is high and your margin is big, or your price is low and your volume is big. It involves your distribution strategy. If you want to go to the 4 marketing P's of how easy it is to do business with you, how convenient it is to do business with you, what your return policies might be if you're a retailer. And it extends certainly to your products and services, that they're actually the greatest communicator of brand value, how high quality they are, or how easy to acquire they are, or those sorts of things. And so you can't separate the business from the brand. You can't separate anything you do from your reputation. And this is advanced branding, is initially the business defines the value of the brand. That is, you start a business, you launch a new product or service, people like it, and they start talking about it, and it starts building equity. But if we are wise as leaders and use intentional brand management to drive the value of our business, to enhance that equity so that we have room to roam in the disruption cycle. And we're now seeing that the world of finance is catching up to the thing that branding experts have always known, which is that brands account for a great deal of value. In this case, The Economist, which is a very reputable publication, said that brands account for more than 30% of market capitalization of companies in the S&P 500. That's a significant fact. Another study at the World Economic Forum said 3/5 of CEOs believe that it's even more valuable. It's more than 40% of their company's market capitalization. That's a gigantic number, and that's something that we should all be paying attention to. To underscore this is a fascinating little tidbit of information here. Fortune magazine annually compiles a list of the world's most admired companies. And as this says, for an astounding 13th straight year, Apple is the #1 most admired company in the world. Okay. Well, here's what's so interesting about that. If you go and you look at Apple's mix of business, as this chart shows, in the lower right-hand corner of this circle, 9.6% of their revenue is from products that they even had 13 years ago. In the past 13 years, everything else on that wheel has been introduced. The iPad didn't exist 13 years ago. The iPhone was just launched at the end of 2007. The earbuds didn't exist all those years ago. The watch didn't exist all those years ago. So if you think about it, when Apple first made the list of the most admired companies to today, only 9.6% of their product line is the same. That's really pretty remarkable. And it underscores this important principle. This really is the thesis of my presentation today. And that is this: your business does not have a brand. Your brand has a business. Now, that might seem like an interesting play on words, but I really mean it. That if you think of your business as having a brand, you will inevitably undervalue the importance of your brand. Whereas if you realize that your brand has a business model, it will make sense. And so the corollary, or the proposition that I propose to you today, is that you should hold tightly to your mission, that whatever that is that you bring to the world, your value equation, but hold loosely to your business model. And I don't know about you, but in my country, we get it reversed. We tend to hold tightly to our model. This is the way we do things. That's sort of what we say. And we hold loosely to our brand. We think that it's fluff or it's extra. And actually the opposite is true. Hold tightly to your mission and hold loosely to your model. With that as a preface, I'd like to present to you the disruption cycle, and I'll bring it back around and tie it together. Now, the disruption cycle, as I mentioned, is based on about 15 years of research my company has done. It's a very simple, straightforward, but battle-tested survey of 53 questions using a proprietary methodology that helps companies understand where they are in the business cycle. And what you see before you is the business cycle. We didn't invent it. Every business school teaches it. We did give it interesting names: disruption, acceleration, maturation, saturation, and commoditization. And the idea here is that every company, every industry goes through stages. And if you're familiar with the disruption of innovation curve, from innovators to laggards, what the customer journey looks like, the company journey looks very similar. That typically a company is born. If it's the first one in the industry is born, goes through a period of rapid acceleration, rapid growth. Eventually, it begins to mature, needs to get more sophisticated, hire C-suite officers and so forth for a period of time. Sooner or later, the company and the industry enter a mode of saturation where there's one too many competitors. And then sooner or later, it becomes commoditized and it becomes just sort of a death spiral for organizations. Now, this cycle can take 10 years in the tech industry, or it could take 100 years in other industries, but it's a cycle nonetheless. And as I said, it affects companies, industries, and economies in some respects. If it's affecting your industry, it can't help but affect your company. And it affects economies. If you think about global economies, there are developing economies. You can put them in the acceleration mode, maturing economies, and there are then mature, tired, old economies. And it's a fascinating thing to think about from a macroeconomic perspective all the way down to a microeconomic perspective. So to give you another example, and I'll just continue the Apple analogy since we've been talking about it. Apple was founded in the 1970s in the garage. Famous story: Steve Jobs and Wozniak, forget his first name, built Apple, and it was just as the computer industry began taking off, and it entered a period of very rapid growth. And then sometime around the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was essentially, in the US at least, a computer on every desk, as Bill Gates had famously forecast. And the industry entered its first period of saturation, where it became sort of a price competitive market. That became a real problem for Apple. In fact, such a problem that they fired Steve Jobs and they brought in John Scully, who was the commodity guy. He worked at PepsiCo to try and manage Apple. And so, in a period of about 15 years, maybe a little more, Apple went entirely through a cycle. Again, the history is somewhat famous that the company almost went bankrupt and out of business. They brought Steve Jobs back. They bought his company and brought him back in. And he went through a period of reinvention and redisruption to reinvent the company, where he launched the iMac and he launched the iPod and eventually the smartphone. Fast forward to 2018, the smartphone market is commoditized. If you think about it, it's saturated. Everybody who has one, not everybody has one, but the market is really saturated. It just so happens that, like companies, people are mortal. So we lose Steve Jobs, and Apple begins to become criticized like any big lumbering commoditized company with product complaints and all sorts of things like that. In fact, they were in such a commoditization mode that the Wall Street Journal wrote a feature article about Apple's procurement executive. And commoditized companies hire procurement executives because what they're trying to do is negotiate the best deals they can, because they have to squeeze that margin. Well, a couple of years ago, to his credit, Tim Cook, the new CEO of Apple, got on stage and introduced Apple's reinvention as a services company. There you go. They've gone through 2 cycles now in less than 50 years. And now they're on their 3rd cycle, redisrupting the market, reframing the company. I can't say whether it's going to succeed or not. Early indications would indicate that it is, but we don't know for sure. But Apple wisely recognizes that in their industry, and this is true of a lot of tech companies, the wheel turns very quickly and they have to pay attention to it. Now, in the US, our initial study, and this is US based, so I don't know how to compare it to India, but it would be a fascinating study to do. Our initial survey in 2018 showed that about 70% of our economy was on the acceleration and maturation path. And 2018 was a very healthy economic year for the US. It was before all the COVID nonsense. And about 30% of our economy was companies that were in saturation and commoditization mode. We didn't have anything to compare that to. It's our benchmark study, but it felt reasonable that 70% of the economy is sort of in growth mode and 30% is less so. Since that time, we've actually been doing interesting deep dives into individual industries. And so, for instance, in the state of Texas, one of the largest states in the United States, we did a disruption cycle study in the insurance industry and found that it was about 50-50. It's a little bit of an older industry with an older business model. And so naturally, about half the companies were growing and about half the companies were struggling. We also did a nationwide study in the real estate industry in the United States, and they're even a little bit worse shape, about 45-55% on the upswing and on the downside. Again, older business model. There is some disruption going in specifically from the technology industry into the real estate industry. But this suggests that maybe real estate brokers in the United States should be paying attention and finding ways to redisrupt their industry. And then, believe it or not, we've done much research in the U.S. funeral industry and found that they're even in worse shape, with 65% of the business in decline. Now, this is a great example of, I mentioned Apple in less than 50 years has gone through 2 cycles and is on their 3rd. In the United States, the funeral industry business model is about 120 years old. And one of the reasons the industry is in such dire straits is because people who've grown up in it don't recognize that the cycle is turning, because it hasn't turned in their lifetime. Or like the hands on a clock, it's turned so slowly that they haven't been able to recognize it. And that's something that's really important to understand, is that the cycle is turning faster than ever. Now, it has always been turning. I like to tell people that in my grandfather's day, 80 years ago, it was common in the United States to have a job for life. You worked for one company basically for your entire career. That doesn't mean that the wheel wasn't turning. What it means is it was turning so slowly that you didn't notice it. When I was a college student many years ago, they told me to prepare for 2 careers, that I was going to have 2 careers. And they didn't explain it in these terms, but I think it reflected the fact that the world is changing and I'm going to have to change with it. And now what we're telling college students, we're not even talking in terms of how many careers you're going to have. We're talking in terms of having a skill set and the ability to learn new things, because you might have any number of careers. This is turning faster than ever. I cite a few examples. In March of 1998, Fortune magazine said that Yahoo won the search wars. And later that year, a little company named Google was launched. Nothing's ever final, nothing's ever permanent. In June of 2007, the iPhone was released. Later that year, Forbes magazine ran a cover story that said nobody could catch the cell phone king Nokia. I believe they had 42% market share at that time. And Nokia is now essentially gone as an organization. You just can't stop the wheels of change. We all know the story of the photography industry. There has never been a time to be a consumer of photography, because in this little machine here, you can carry around all the photos you can imagine. When I go on vacation now or holiday, I don't even take a regular camera because the lens in my iPhone is so good. This is a chart, we all know the story, but this is a chart that really shows it dramatically. And if you were to look at the stock price chart of a company like Kodak, it looks very much like this, with the stock price just declining right about the time that the smartphone was introduced. A similar story, which is just fascinating to me, is this chart, which is a picture of recorded music revenues in the United States. And you can see the different peaks based on the different modes. And the peak of the industry was about $20 billion when CDs were selling at their peak in the late 1990s. You saw what happened to the industry between 2000 and 2015. All of that revenue was lost. In fact, here's a chart that shows it in similar fashion. You can see the decline, and then it has come back up a bit. But what I'd like to point out to you is behind those bars of decline, that space that you see behind there, that revenue is just gone. It didn't go to another competitor. It just evaporated. So similarly, there's never been a better time to be a music consumer than now, because again, in this little box, you can carry around any music that you'd like, but it's a very difficult time for music producers. In fact, all of the big concert acts went back on the road because that was the only way they could make money. And now again, with the pandemic, that's been a problem for them. Fascinating to study and watch. Technology affects us all, change affects us all, global trade affects us all, and it just keeps the cycle going. And there's a term for that that Joseph Schumpeter coined called creative destruction, which is a wonderful thing for consumers, not so wonderful for businesses. It's a wonderful thing for consumers because what it suggests is that the old is destroyed as the new is brought in. And there's a lot of things to celebrate about that. Global income per day prior to 1800 was $2, and today it's $40 average across the world. And if current trends continued in today's dollars, they're saying that by 2100 it'll be $170. Similarly, people living in poverty, according to the World Bank, has gone down dramatically from 90% in 1820 to 8.6% in 2020. I understand it's going up a little bit because of the pandemic, but it's really remarkable what creative destruction has done for us. Life expectancy growing significantly as well. Nevertheless, if you're in business, you might need to worry a little bit, because what's good for consumers is not always good for companies, because some of us are on the losing end of creative destruction. So we prefer to think of it more in terms of creative disruption. If you think in terms of the disruption cycle, if you can understand it, if you can understand your company's place in it, if you can understand what strategies you should pursue based on your company's place in it, you can take a creative approach to disrupting the market so that you're not part of the destruction. So we like the term creative disruption. And to help you understand that, I'd like to explain how you can be an agent of change using the understanding of the disruption cycle. So a professor friend of mine from UCLA, who's a brilliant man, this is one of my favorite quotes. It doesn't really roll off the tongue, but he says the most important element of a strategy is a coherent viewpoint about the forces at work, not a plan. And I find that write plans for a living. We make plans that we pride ourselves on our ability to plan. But what Professor Rummelt is saying here is that if our viewpoint about the forces at work is incorrect, our plans are going to be incorrect as well. And that's another great way to underscore the value of the disruption cycle, is it helps us to understand the true forces that are at work. So what I'd like to do briefly is show you what happens in each phase of the cycle. And depending upon what phase your company may be in, or a company that you've worked for in the past, I think you'll recognize it. And it's really a fascinating thing to look at. So in the acceleration phase, this is typically when companies are new, or divisions of companies are new, or there's a new product or a new service launched. It's a great time. You're not always making money. Sometimes you're not profitable yet, but you can see the kind of statements on the right there that CEOs of accelerating companies would tend to strongly agree with, that we're achieving our goals, we're struggling to keep up with demand, it's hard to hire people, we're good at employee retention because there's a great small team here, we're all in sync, we operate well together, we embrace change. It's a good time. These are the good old days, if you will, that companies look back on. And in acceleration mode, the kind of challenges that companies deal with tend to be external in nature, like a competitive marketplace, or mastering that new technology, or training new employees, or innovation and change, and those sorts of things. It's a wonderful time to be alive as a company. And as I said, this could be a 2-year period, it could be a 20-year period, when the industry is in rapid acceleration. It just depends on the industry. But sooner or later, things get big enough that you have to start maturing as a company, and the industry starts maturing as well, whether that's expanding into new markets or new states, whether it's expanding into adjacent categories of business. But companies in this stage say our growth is outpacing our ability to maintain quality, and that's a problem. We're outgrowing our internal systems. So this is where you might install an enterprise resource planning software. This is where you might hire your first chief financial officer. Those sorts of decisions get made. But things are still good. This is where companies make a lot of money. This is where your margins are healthy. This is where you need to be investing in building that brand equity, knowing that saturation is coming. And again, this could be a 5-year period. It could be a 25-year period. You just have to know that sooner or later it's going to end. So you have to do the best you can while you're in the maturation phase. And again, what companies are dealing with are competition, of course, is very big, change, growth, staffing. I don't know exactly what it's like in India, but in the United States, regulations enters the picture here, because anytime an industry is growing and thriving, the government discovers it and looks to regulate it. Or key industry players look to the government to set up barriers to entry to other companies. And so regulation becomes a factor in the maturation phase. So could be acceleration and maturation, could be a decade, could be 20 years, could be 30 years, could be 40 years. Sooner or later, however, if there's an industry that is growing and profitable, it's going to attract one too many competitors. And that's when it enters saturation, where growth begins to slow and companies begin to feel lost. And one of the tragic things about the saturation phase, if you're not understanding it, is that most companies, when they enter saturation, most corporate leaders tend to blame themselves because they think they're doing something wrong. They've been succeeding for so long. What am I doing wrong? Sometimes they are doing something wrong. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes the industry is just in saturation mode, and you can see the sort of things that companies begin to deal with, and the sort of issues. Of course, pricing rears its ugly head because there's too many competitors. So it becomes a very price competitive, bid driven market. Nepotism can be an issue if it's a closely family held business and the first generation is starting to step out. There are often issues of succession and nepotism that cause ill feelings internally. Leadership gets questioned, sometimes by the leaders themselves, and we find that that's a real problem. If left unaddressed, the industry, the company move into commoditization mode, and you can see the kind of things that CEOs in this mode say. It's a very difficult place to be. Work can sometimes infringe on your personal relationships. It can affect your health. The company is just not healthy. There tends to be more gossip and internal division at work, and things just start to unravel and unwind. And in commoditization mode, the leadership issue becomes even bigger. Miscommunication, trying to retain employees who are looking for opportunities elsewhere, especially your best employees. Satisfaction is a problem. Corporate culture becomes a problem. And this is where many companies and many industries go to die. So left unaddressed, the natural cycle of a business, as Sir George said, is to be born, to grow, to live, and to die. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way because we can have an impact. And the key to understanding our impact is understanding what's going on inside the firm during the four stages. So this gets back to the first book I wrote based on our original research study called When Growth Stalls: How It Happens, Why You're Stuck, and What to Do About It, where we identified 4 destructive internal dynamics. And I'll be really curious to see how these hold up in your culture, because I think they're universal human characteristics, but you can be the judge of how relevant they are. And they're pictured on the left, that when companies begin to run into rough waters, the first thing that happens is a lack of consensus or a lack of alignment among the management team, that people start to question each other. They start to doubt each other. Sometimes, and in some cultures, that can be overt. It can be the butting of heads. Sometimes it can be very subtle. It can be a rolling of the eyes, or it can be a hallway conversation, or it could be passive aggression, or those sorts of things. That's a problem. Another problem is when companies stall, they start to lose their focus, maybe chasing business they shouldn't be chasing, discounting their prices, accepting jobs they wouldn't normally accept, because they're sort of grasping for new growth. That relates to the third problem, which is a loss of nerve or courage or conviction, where companies, they get frightened. And very often that manifests itself by cutting back their marketing budget or their training budget or their research and development budget. And they start to kind of turn inward, which is not a good thing. And then the fourth is an inconsistency, where they start casting about, looking for solutions everywhere, but sticking with none. And the difficult thing is, this tends to become a cycle, a vicious cycle, where the lack of alignment can fuel the loss of focus, which only fuels the loss of nerve and the inconsistency, and companies will get in this cycle and they'll spin downward. The mirror image of that is where success is. When a management team is fully aligned and on board together, where they have focus in the marketplace, however they define that, they go to market with courage and conviction and aggressively, and they do that consistently. It's a wonderful place to be. The difficult thing that we have found is that it's not easy to stay in the virtuous cycle in the green. That's the art of leadership. It's very easy and quite natural to fall into the vicious cycle of the red. So this was our first research, and it was really fascinating. And on our website for years, we've had a self-diagnosis feature where people could visit it, answer 20 questions. It only takes a minute. And up would pop a little thermometer that gives them a sense of how healthy or unhealthy their company is. And it's been a fascinating and fun thing to do. When we launched the disruption cycle research, we incorporated this research into it. And I want to show you how just incredibly these things correlate. In the acceleration mode, this is what the internal dynamics profile looks like in the center there. You can see that all 4 factors, lack of consensus, loss of focus, loss of nerve, inconsistency, are in the green, which means they're healthy. They're not perfect, because no company is perfect, but they're in the green. Generally speaking, corporate culture tends to be very healthy in the acceleration mode. When you get into maturation, you see a similar pattern. Not perfect, but very healthy. And why wouldn't it be? You're winning. You're making money. You're making bonuses. You're succeeding in the marketplace. You're getting interviewed, by the press or whatever the case may be. Corporate culture tends to be very healthy as well. But watch what happens in saturation mode. The internal dynamics tend to revert to the mean. And the first one that we see this, not always, but often, the first one that tips is the lack of alignment. The lack of consensus goes into the red, because companies begin questioning, leaders of companies begin questioning each other, and sometimes questioning themselves. And if left unaddressed, what happens is the patient gets very, very sick. And so I mentioned that we sort of call this a thermometer. That is a fair way of looking at this, that when a company is healthy, just like when a body is healthy, it's robust. It's fighting off with its antibodies anything that would be attacking it. But when a company gets sick, the immune system, the corporate culture can get depressed, And if left untreated, the company can actually die. And what we have found in our research is that more often than not, the cause of corporate death is internal, not external. Because while we all face difficult external challenges, we're all smart people and they're addressable. There are proven strategies, lots of things you can consider to address those external dynamics. But if your internal culture is unhealthy, especially if you are not terribly awake and alert to it, if you don't realize what's happening to you, it will eat your company from within. As we're fond of telling companies, the lack of alignment, the lack of consensus is the single worst problem, not only because it's the most common that we see, but if your management team is not aligned, it doesn't matter what your strategy is because it won't get executed well. And that's why it's so very important for those internal dynamics to match. Now, I want to show you something else that I think is really fascinating. As you look at the cycle, and these are the charts that you just saw, as you move from left to right or clockwise around the disruption cycle, you see how the internal dynamics tend to suffer. And if you align under them the issues that companies say that they deal with, and you saw these as well on previous slides, there's something really fascinating happening here. And this is the 30,000 foot level of what you need to do to cope with the cycle. If you look at the two on the left, when your company is most relevant to the market, you're most focused on the market. So you're concerned with things like competition and technology and innovation. On the right, when your company is least relevant to the market, you're least focused on the market. You become inwardly focused and you focus on things like leadership and retention and miscommunication and those cultural issues. It's really rather remarkable. So at a very high level, the very highest level, the way to deal with the disruption cycle, if you're in saturation and commoditization mode, is to refocus your attention onto the marketplace, away from yourself, onto the marketplace, which coincidentally leads you to examine the needs of the consumer, the changing needs of the consumer, and innovate and disrupt if you'll hold loosely to your model. See, if you're holding on tightly to your business model, you can't change. If you don't care what your business model is, as long as your company is accomplishing its mission, you have the proper mindset for change. So back to the proposition, hold tightly to your mission, hold loosely to your model. And this is all the reason why, because the disruption cycle is a real thing. Creative destruction is real. You can't stop it. All you can do is understand it. And it's like a wave on the ocean. It can drown you or you can surf on it. If you learn how to surf on the disruption cycle, you hold tightly to your mission, but loosely to your model, you can survive. So there's a couple different ways of doing it. I won't go into great detail, but we've talked about Apple. This is a company that has really entirely reinvented itself twice. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is what the global conglomerates do, like a PepsiCo, where they have a product line in each phase of the cycle at all times. So as old soft drinks like Pepsi and Mountain Dew are being commoditized, they're inventing new products like coconut water and those sorts of things. Same thing on the food service side. They've had Lay's potato chips and Frito forever, but then they invite kale chips and fruit chips and those sorts of things. So one way of doing it is to reorient the company entirely, but you don't have to do that. Another way of doing it is just to make sure that you're continually reinventing yourself in your mix of products and services. So as I wrap this up, back to the beginning, the core of every business is dying. But Sir George didn't stop there. He said something else about it. He says every business has a dying core because it's the old heart of the business. That's what we've been talking about. The only way you're going to be able to grow the business is by making sure you have two things going, a balance between how you manage the decline or the stability of the core. You should never walk away from it. It's your cash cow. It's your core business. You want to optimize it and maximize it. There's all kinds of strategies to do that. While at the same time, always having an eye to innovation, always having an eye to letting your business model go, always having an eye to do something in new areas. So if, as I've been speaking, you've been thinking, I wonder where my company is, perhaps you have a sense of where your company is, perhaps you'd like to know where your company is, I'd like to offer you the opportunity to take the survey yourself. And in this wonderful, globally connected world, if you want to take a screen capture of this or a photo of it with your phone, our website is mckeewallwork.com. And if you enter /CII, it will take you to the disruption cycle survey, where you can take this survey yourself anytime, and it will send you a report. And in the report, you'll get an overview of your company. You'll get a prediction of where your company places you in the disruption cycle, so that you can ask questions like, why are we here, and how do we get here, and where are we going? You'll get to examine your company and compare it. Now, this is interesting. You'd be comparing your answers to the US survey average. That might be a really fascinating thing to study, because, as I said, this is the database that we have is of US companies. So you'd be able to do that on every question. So you can ask questions like, what does it mean? And are we better off or worse off than others, and so forth? And you will get your own thermometer that will give you the 4-factor analysis, as we call it, to give you a sense, just a sense of your corporate health, to give you something to think about and something to talk about internally. So you can ask, why are we here, and how do we get here, and where are we going? So I invite you to go to mckeewallwork.com/CII. The first 10 respondents, if you're interested in doing that, we'll be happy to do a 30-minute report review and consultation via Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx. For the first 10 of you that do it, we can go over your report together if you'd like. So no obligation there. We just thought you might be interested in it. I think hopefully you found this presentation thought-provoking and stimulating. And I would be curious to hear, love to hear your feedback. You can see my email address there on the screen, and I'll leave it up. And I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. It's a real pleasure and an honor. And I will turn it back over now to you. Thank you.
Hi, Steve. Thank you very much. I think that was a fascinating presentation, into the insights on the times of disruptions that we are in. Thanks once again. I would request, the participants to actually go on to McKee Wallwork and, Steve's site and share their thoughts as Steve suggested, and take the survey. Thank you, Steve, again for joining us. I know it's very late there, and, perhaps we look forward to working with you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.